incredible how many things can go wrong in one's life in such a short period of time. On to the theater. Apologies for the audio. Apologies for the absolutely breathtaking content. Look at that friggin' old world wonder. I know that's what you came here, folks. The old historic American buildings, which is what I proclaimed that I was covering. Unfortunately, the historical American building survey sometimes looks like this. Not a care in the world, not a how, not a why. Just strolling along past this pile of rubble. We are told, however, that this is not rubble. This is a historical American building. You will feast your eyes upon it. Look at it. This is your future, America. Let me slap a little disclaimer on here, as has been the case sometimes with Wyoming. Much to my dismay, we are not dealing with eye candy, folks. Not today. It's almost an addendum to the Yellowstone one, so just a heads up, this one's going to be a little low on visual. After all, if it's a cold brew, it must be mine. If you've been with us for a minute, you know that, well, they are capable of anything, anytime. We could burst into song, mockery, drawings. We could take a total detour into reckless speculation. Or we could dive balls deep into an insanely boring narrative. Now, this is a search for truth. I mean, that's what this is. This is a poring over of documents, looking at our history. In order for the lies that we suspect to be there, the lies, at times, they have to contain some truths in order for them to be effective and believable. And so sometimes we veer into the realm of what seems to me to be truth. Now, this might not scratch that mystery itch. It might not get us any closer to solving any problems. And I will admit, I'm often tempted to skip these and search for the more sensational sort of investigation that really piques the mind and draws you in. But I believe that the background, the static, I've come to believe, maybe I'm growing older or wiser or neither. Well, older for sure, but maybe not wiser, unless you mean Budweiser. Scratch that from the record, Jimmy, wherever you are. Sometimes we gotta veer into the realm of truth so that we can better tell the lie. Does that make sense? Well, it hadn't occurred to me till just now, but maybe I am just justifying boring content. But at least I've let you know ahead of time, right? So if you're not interested in strange tales of homesteaders in the late 1800s, early 1900s, well, this one might not be for you, but I guess you probably wouldn't be in a video called Historic American Building Survey Wyoming Volume 5, now would you? Because it's not like Wyoming's known for its old world splendor. Not old world in the way that we say it. Now, here is a dugout. Very boring territory here, but let's talk about these dugouts. I don't know why, I just feel compelled to. You may not be interested in this at all, but I do feel like it's of interest. It's of interest to understand the minds of the early actual homesteaders and pioneers, which of course they did exist. People that showed up here to eke out an existence. And also it's a way of understanding the past, understanding how one could survive by oneself. And maybe this information will come of use to you one day should our society collapse and you find yourself out on the high plains and the fringes of society, which is probably more likely than it isn't. Damn it, now we done burnt the grids. Now, why are we talking about dugouts? Primarily because of this here Rockwell homestead, which is going to give us a little insight what it would have been like to actually come here in Wyoming, the story that they actually like to promote about how there being nothing here, and how one would survive, and perhaps some did. I'd say, yeah, some did come here and survive this way. This is in Campbell County, about 15 miles southeast of Wright. Now, we are told it is within the North Rochelle coal mine permit area. It belonged to a gentleman named Thornburg, who was associated with early dryland farming and ranching on the semi-arid lands of Campbell County. We're told it's in good physical condition. We're told it is unusually well crafted, which makes one wonder if indeed is it as old as they say it is, or it's a sort of a museum artifact. When they tell us about dinosaurs and stuff like that, they say it for sure existed in the Triassic area, blah, 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 ankylosaurus, this and that. But here we're told it's probably constructed by Jack Thornburg sometime between 1920 and 1937, which seems a little late, honestly, to be building things like this. However, we're told it's possible that the former resident, Hartwell B. Kelly, built it during his occupancy between 1917 and 1919. Again, if you're not at war, a foxhole for survival, it seems odd that you would have something like this in the great Gilded Age, the 1900s. But anyway, we're told that this is impossible to determine the building sequence. Paucity of associated artifacts do not indicate long-term occupation. That's what we're told here. Remaining site evidence suggesting Mr. Thornburg could have built a larger wood frame. He could have lived here for an unknown period of time until he was able to build a large wood-frame dwelling, and more time and care was spent on its construction than the typical root cellar would warrant. Secondly, the well for the homestead, which is where Rockwell, the name, comes from, is located in close proximity, which is an indication that it was used as a dwelling for at least a short period of time, and appears that the floor was composed of large diameter flagstones at some point. There's also actually a copper grounding rod, oddly, still in place at this location. Copper grounding rod inside of this very rustic home, along with oxidized tin can fragments and some clear bottle fragments and stuff like that. And so here's the rock well for this homestead, which is very well protected and covered, obviously. So we're told when the early pioneers moved here, there's a scarcity of available timber for building, not many trees in the area, and therefore they have to use the materials at hand, which is basically just sod and stone. Well, this one has a stone dugout, but oftentimes they were made from sod. And if you ever find yourself stuck out in a prairie, maybe you can use some of this information. Now, usually they dig into a bank, so you don't have to build these complete walls, and you could easily roof it over. The average life of this sort of dugout was 6 or 7 years, which makes this one particularly compelling. By that time, supposedly, the homesteader would have enough time to establish your fields and fence your land and have enough income to construct a permanent dwelling. But it was not uncommon for homesteaders, especially bachelors, to continue living in these sod houses for an extended period of time. So usually they choose a hill on the side of a ravine or along a water course, and the bank usually is sort of steep, and so you dig a hole about 10 by 14 or 12 by 18, somewhere in there. You plow a low-lying area where the sod is sort of moist, and then with a spade you cut the sod into bricks, well, a few feet long, and then you place them side by side to form the front, and then every other layer you put crosswise to kind of bind it better. You could use dirt as a filler, or you could drive sticks down through them to provide reinforcement, the same way you kind of use rebar and concrete. And the longer wall is usually parallel to the face of the ravine. The rear wall is the natural wall of the bank. And usually you can kind of make this out in a few days. You would take logs and poles and brush and grass, and you use it to finish the roof. Like, you use several logs or posts for a door frame, which you kind of drive into the soil. Here they've used planks maybe. And if you've got enough wood, you can make a window frame for the front wall, often next to the door. The front wall usually made of like square cut sod, and the side walls are usually partially formed from the bank of the ravine. Sometimes you might want to put some cut sod squares or logs to prevent caving along the sides, as is done here with stone. Then you find the longest pole you can, which serves as a ridge pole. You put that across the dugout parallel to the ravine, as pictured there. And if the sod walls don't support this, you can put a couple posts with forks at the top to support its weight. And then you spread, brush and layers of prairie grass to cover the rafters, which you're going to put perpendicular to the main support pole. And then you put a thick layer of dirt over the top of this. And occasionally you can cut sod squares. You could see sometimes they put those on top of the brush and grass. And during times of rainfall, though, this stuff is not waterproof, obviously. So oftentimes they would dig a trench across the floor to drain it. I don't see one here. The front door is usually made of wood and secured with leather hinges. If wood's not available, you can use a blanket or cotton or canvas. Usually canvas that came from the wagon. You could use cheesecloth or muslin or animal skins as like a window pane. And sometimes it would stretch this sort of material across the ceiling to prevent dirt and insects from falling in. The floors are usually hard-packed earth, which after a while they could be swept clean. And wooden floors were not very common because, wood is scarce out here, and also dripping rain warps them and makes them more of a nuisance than a luxury. And so many times they just had rugs or skins over the floor. Interior walls are sometimes smoothed down and plastered with a mixture of clay and ashes. And sometimes you might have in the more long-term ones a whitewash made with plaster. You could often find them papered with large pages from catalogs or newspapers or letters, which is also common, like log cabins. They'll do that. Wallpaper it just to reduce draft through the cracks in the logs. And usually it's just a one-room house. Many disadvantages, obviously, living in a sod dugout, but there are some advantages. I mean, it's better protection from the winds. It's a natural haven for protection against tornadoes. You could bring in a few livestock in a severe storm. Safer in the event of like fires. It's also easier to heat in the wintertime, and naturally cool in the intense summer heat. The chief disadvantage is obviously the porosity of the roof. After heavy rain, water would collect by the front door, mosquitoes would build up, standing water is obviously unhealthy, pots and pans usually put all around the room to catch the dripping water. Many women were very unhappy here, if you can imagine. Someone holding an umbrella over your head while you cook on the stove, or it's not uncommon for the roof to become soaked and to collapse. Ventilation is poor. Snakes and animals sometimes would come inside. Another hazard was livestock wandering under the roof. A man in livery stable owner in Texas told a writer for Scribner's magazine that he drove over such a dwelling and wondered what made the ground so uneven until the proprietor came out with a Winchester in his hand. Usually a woman, we're told, a man didn't keep his woman, or his wife, not that he owned her, you know what I'm saying. You usually want to store or shelter your wife in store. You usually want to shelter your wife and family in a dugout for as short a time as possible. According to an article in the Wichita Morning Eagle, the man who kept his family in a dugout for more than 2 or 3 years was considered shiftless. Many women objected strenuously to living in a dugout, as you can imagine. One Nebraska woman burst into tears when she saw her shelter for the first time, and another Kansas pioneer woman is quoted in the same article stating that she wouldn't
live in a hole in the ground like a prairie dog.
Not uncommon, though, for bachelors who don't give a bleep to reside in a dugout for several years, until they get 30 or 40 acres under cultivation and increase their livestock and save sufficient sum to pay for finer house and belongings. So evidently the bachelor was able to reside much longer without the social pressure of removing a wife or family from such a dwelling. And so that's the history of the dugout and the story of the Rockwell Homestead dugout, which is a particularly fine example. This is the Dunlap Ranch, also in the same kind of area. It's scheduled for destruction in the future, which is our past, due to mine expansion. So this is a mitigation plan, and this is the story behind it. It's a story of the same county, Campbell County, and the history of it, so that we can build a picture of what happened here in this part of the United States and why. Looking at this from behind the shifty spectacles of a global domineer would be, you can paint a picture in your mind of this vast country here, that how are we going to make use of it? How are we going to get rich off it? How can we convince people to settle it and mine things for us? People to move here and farm things for us? Or is this just a useless piece of land? And imagine someone with greedy, self-serving intentions looking at this vast plains and wondering how exactly they can bend it to their will. So this area, this region that comprises the state of Wyoming, was settled quite late in the nation's history. Arable land east of the Mississippi had been taken up prior to the Great Western migration to Oregon and the Salt Lake Valley. That was in the 1840s. So thousands of westbound immigrants passed through this region on the Oregon Trail, looking for more fertile lands to the west. And those areas were rapidly populated. And then there was the development of the cattle industry and the Texas trail drives in the 1860s and 70s, which turned their attention to these, even now, sparsely populated northern. Well, as the same stories were told everywhere in this friggin' earth, with the first transcontinental railroad through what is now southern Wyoming in 1867 or 1868, now distant cattle markets could be reached. These vast grass and sagebrush lands were found to be conducive to the fattening up of the cattle. Thus, Wyoming becomes suddenly attractive to the prospective stock raiser. Unfortunately, the federal land policy that was already in operation had been conceived under far different environmental and climatic conditions east of the Mississippi. Therefore, the Homestead Acts that were passed by Congress, who'd never been there, to settle the public domain involved land parcels that were too small. Now, these prairie grasses you see are very nutritious to livestock, but you need up to 40 acres of rangeland to maintain each animal. That puts some little 40 acres and mule in perspective, really, because 40 acres is what you would need to maintain said mule. Congress belatedly recognized the needs of the western rancher and farmer, but the alteration of the land laws was too slow, and it was too late. The alteration of the land laws was too slow, and it was too late to save the homesteader. So these measures were untenable, and things like the Timber Culture Act of 1873, they just assumed that a homesteader on the northern plains could grow large stands of trees in these semi-arid, lands. And the Desert Land Act of 1877 just assumes that the West could be made to bloom like the East just by irrigating unwatered lands. And these early legislators failed to realize that there were a few year-round water sources that existed, and those that did were already controlled by the earliest of arrivals. So the cattlemen become the first permanent new settlers, people living here, that saw the advantage in the vast grasslands and this county in particular. However, they've been prevented from moving in here until a government treaty in 1876, of course, removed the indigenous Native American reservations outside the area. And then several large cattle outfits were established within the confines of Campbell County along the major drainages, and then vast cattle herds were allowed to roam the intervening rangeland. The disastrous blizzards of which you know all about, I'm sure, in 1886 and the overstocking of the range, they destroyed many of these cattle barons, and they completely ended the open range system as ranching. So the cattle industry here was actually depressed, and they had to fence their lands and develop hay meadows to prepare for these winter food supplies because they weren't ready for these severe storms. And so the dry land farming movement, it reaches its height after 1900 when the cattlemen were still rebuilding this industry. Dry land farming was difficult and involved a series of techniques that conserved rainfall in order to grow crops in semi-arid regions. There had to be a basic minimum annual rainfall, like 15 inches. This dry land farming movement had a profound effect, coupled with increased immigration in the United States and the scarcity of good, cheap farming land. Homesteaders had to turn to these submarginal lands throughout Wyoming with these new techniques. They tried this in 1870 at small Swedish settlements called Salem, which is about 40 miles northeast of Cheyenne by my reckoning, and as the crow flies. Campbell County, named after the Campbell system developed by Hardy Campbell, was used in Nebraska and Kansas, and his theory was based on storing and conserving the natural rainfall by compressing subsoil, keeping topsoil loose by cultivation. Very difficult work, and you had to leave big chunks free of moisture, robbing vegetation, and dry. And the theory of dry farming is pretty sound, and actually they still practice it today in other similar areas. Nevertheless, a basic amount of rainfall is necessary, and below that amount, dry farming is not even possible. Well, below that amount, not any farming is possible. Wyoming encouraged dry land settlement through the Board of Immigration, which is weaponized and created in 1911. I shouldn't say weaponized, economized, or utilized as an economic tool. Newspapers extolled the virtues of dry land farming. Of course, the railroads advertised on this nationwide basis to settle these regions through which they passed, trying to figure out a way to monetize these regions. Dr. V.T. Cook, expert in the technique from Oregon, was brought to Wyoming and appointed director of dry farming experiments to the town of Gillette, which is where this is, and the creation of Campbell County. When the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad was built through the region in 1891, a couple guys who were employees of the contracting firm, they filed preemption entries of 160 acres and got their patents that same year, which was pretty fast return time. And these homesteads were purchased by the Lincoln Townsite Company, another group of railroaders, and the towns were platted the same month. Lots were sold for $1 an acre, and within 3 months, Gillette was a thriving community with a mayor and a justice of the peace. And they were able to somehow, even though they got their patents July 25th, able to ship cattle less than a month later in August 1891, which leads me to believe that they probably occupied these lands before the patent was actually granted. That would be my guesstimation. But Gillette continued to flourish during the earliest years. They grew to up to 400 people by 1910. It was the county seat when Campbell County was created from Crook and Weston, and the whole Campbell County had a population total of 2,316 people. Most of them were engaged in farming and ranching. Now this was before the coal industry had anything to do with the region. However, when the Bank of Gillette failed in 1923, like just about every other bank, farmers and ranchers who were able to survive, they experienced rather good years in the late 1920s, probably because the bank failed, would be my guess. I wouldn't mind if my banks failed. Actually, I highly encourage it. So the Resettlement Administration, which was created by an executive order in 1935, starts buying homesteads that were abandoned or operating at a loss for $2 an acre, and purchases continued all through the 1940s. And these lands were returned to their status as grazing lands. Some of the residents were resettled, etc. Now then, the Dunlap Ranch, which is what you've been staring at so patiently while I finished up my oration of the history of the region, which I found kind of somewhat fascinating, although a bit dry. You may describe it as boringer than hell. This story, while not very interesting, I believe it paints a picture of the average homesteader, okay? So far, we've touched upon the bachelor homesteader. This is going to be your family homesteader. So, Charles Oscar Dunlap and his son, William Oscar Dunlap, who was just known as Oscar Dunlap. Charles was born in Wheeling, West Virginia, which is fun because we just spent some time there at the West Virginia survey. I love parallels like that. He moved to Nebraska in 1884, makes his home in Giltner. His son's born in 1892. Together, they moved to the Powder River Basin after looking for land in Montana. So they do this around age of 28. The son's about 28. So 1913, 1914, they move here. They build their dwellings that same year. Unfortunately, Mrs. Charles died in 1914. 1914 and may never have even seen the ranch that they built. Charles used to live in the stuccoed ranch house that he built, and his son lived in a small wood frame cabin. And when Oscar married Opal Riddle, who lived on the Riddle Ranch about 6 miles south, sure the pickings were slim as far as finding a valid partner, and Richard, their son, was born in 1920. Charles died at the age of 77 after suffering severe heat prostration. In 1930, his parcel passed to his son, Oscar. Charles and Oscar built up their ranch. They made dwellings, barns, outbuildings. They raised white-faced cattle. They grew wheat, oats, corn. They did this with about 40 horses. They had about 125 cows. They weren't far from Gillette, but they were kind of self-sufficient. They had a large garden for veggies. They had hogs, milk cows, chickens for meat, milk, cream, butter, eggs. Well, the excess produce was taken to town and traded for groceries, and the cream was sold to Nebraska through the railroad. They used to dig, before they dug a well, they had to transport water in a barrel with a horse and wagon from a spring. In 1920s, they dug a well east of the older ranch house. They planted about 1,000 trees, trying to establish windrows and shade. They had to carry bucket by bucket from water from the well, painstakingly to do this. And most of the trees ended up dying, as you can tell. But they did manage to establish a number of Chinese elms and some poplars behind the ranch house. And they dug 9 stock ponds with a team of horses and a Fresno for their horses, or for their livestock. They later realized that their ranch was located on one of the largest coal deposits in the United States. And they actually were digging coal out of these exposed seams and banks within a few miles, and they were using it for fuel. So they had a bunch of subsistence strategies. They raised hundreds of chickens. They used the hens for laying eggs and the roosters for eating. They maintained a hog house, and they butchered 4 to 5 a year, which they sugar cured and canned. And as if the depression weren't hard enough, Mr. Oscar lost his eyesight in 1933. So about 2% vision. He had to rely on his son Richard to run the ranch. And they held on to it through the Depression when so many others failed. And when neighboring homesteaders failed, they were able to acquire their lands. Oscar did not believe in debt or paying interest. He would only buy land where he could afford to do so. He sold some from a profit, but eventually they had about 3,000 acres. When Richard reaches high school age, he moved to Gillette with his uncle, gets an education, comes back to the ranch, gets married, continues to live there, raise 3 children. They didn't have electricity or a phone until 1950. They had a 32-volt generator for lights. When the teacher resigned from the only school 2 miles east, he moved his family to Gillette and ran the ranch on a part-time basis. And eventually, after Oscar passed away at the age of 88, this Dunlap ranch fell into disrepair and now being destroyed due to mine expansion. So there you have a success story of a family in the region. The Union Hall, which you'd think, based on its look, would be a vast departure from the area. But this Union Hall here, allegedly, belongs to a place called Superior. I'm not sure we made such a jump, but this is the way that the survey rolls, bro. And this is a Superior Union Hall, it's called, in Sweetwater County. I think presently, or at least lately, it was known as the Green River Courthouse, but originally it belonged to the United Mine Works of America. Superior Local constructed the Superior Union Hall, we are told, to serve the Union and the community. It had a stage and a dance floor on the second floor. And we're told that the people in the coal mining town of Superior could assemble here for cultural, political, and social events. One of the largest assembly halls in the town, and it was not actually owned by the coal company, somehow. So the town of South Superior comes into existence as a result of coal mining development along Horse Thief Canyon. Normal ups and downs associated with an economy based on coal mining. The town's entire economy revolved around mining. Mines closed in the 1950s or 60s, and the population plummeted from 900 to 200. The nearby town of Superior had 1,600 residents in 1925 and 0 people by 1970. So when construction began is not known. Probably 1903, we're told, when the first coal prospect was made. Around 1907, the town set of Superior begins to emerge, and by 1915, we're told 1,300 people lived there. So the historic town of Superior is located in Upper Horse Thief Canyon. It's a company town built by Superior Coal. Later, Union Pacific Coal Company takes control of the mine, and actually, from what I can tell, Superior Coal had always been a subsidiary of Union Pacific, so kind of a shell company. These mining interests operated a mining camp called Japtown, because there was a large Japanese population somehow. So while the mining camps were being built, 2 communities were established. One was called Dogtown, then there was South Superior, which was initially called White City, which is interesting, and it became the commercial center of the area, the White City, huh? White cities everywhere. Since the town was independently owned and operated, when the mines closed, the residents remained there. And then all of these villages and communities are often lumped together and called just Superior. But in actuality, only the Union Pacific run community is actually where the town site is located. Now, there's an interesting look at the foundation of this building. So after Union Pacific officially takes over Superior Coal Company, the town experiences rapid growth. There's 200 plus residential structures. There's also a bank, an opera house, a hospital, and several schools. Hold on a sec, it's my turn. This Portugal railway game. Jump in there. Okay, anyway. We're told that this mine suffered from an overabundance of water, right? And when the town dried up in the 1950s, when Union Pacific began to slowly close down its coal mine, the Union Pacific had a tough decision. Because unlike other abandoned coal mines, here at Superior, there's privately owned property juxtaposed in the middle of the company land. And so to avoid paying property taxes and prevent the homes from falling into disrepair, the houses were either removed, dismantled and moved, or they had to pull off, which meant pulling out utilities and shutting off water. However, because the town of South Superior was nearby, they had to continue at least minimal services to the private homes and businesses. So instead of being able to shut down the water, they had to maintain portions of water lines until they could make different arrangements. So kind of an interesting little battle ensued. And this Union Hall allegedly is supposed to symbolize the fact that bituminous coal was a significant force in the development of this county, fueling the locomotives, and though the bulk of the coal extracted by Union Pacific later came from different mines. So this hall is built of concrete and brick. It's been infilled with bricks and new doorways are present. The wood frame, surrounds, and glass has been removed. Apparently there used to be a row of 8 square windows, and you can see here that randomly cars were abandoned here. I don't understand building this building on such a grade, or this one for that matter, and it does call into question what exactly went on here. I see the local artists have graced it with their presence. 13 years of age would be my guess, and the only benefit to having don't mind if I do. I guess they could be 40. The only benefit to having such distinguished artwork is you can tell which room you're in. See? This building's very interesting in a way. I see the stage and the dance floor allegedly. I see the raised shelf around the edge, which I don't know about that, why that would even be the case in a dance floor. It's very interesting, the symbolism, the old world sort of tiles, but everything looking like it's made of wood and not very substantial, to be honest with you. Although why you would have a basement in such a room or construct it in such a manner is impossible for me to say. We have a closer look at the little medallion out front. And honestly, in such a sparsely populated area, I would say that this looks more like some sort of a power station than anything else. Although it does lack the usual bay openings that we are accustomed to seeing. Interesting place here. And it seems rather out of the ordinary, doesn't it? These pictures obviously taken at different times, because here you see this car is complete, and here you see it's completely upside down and missing its wheels. So I'm not really sure what sort of land this is on, but the whole area looks rather sad and abandoned, like most of these areas. When you have large-scale industry that just abruptly pulls out. Sorry about the phrasing. It's a curious thing, Wyoming, when you have this sort of juxtaposition between people literally scratching in the dirt to make their homes out of basically non-existent freaking wood, and then you have large buildings like that. And now we'll get to the third and final of the long-winded, dry stories that I've selected for this particular leg of the survey. And if you are still with me, I commend your patience. Here, and this is the story of someone named Geraldine Lucas. Now, far be it from me to cast doubt on someone's existence, maybe your grandmother or a distant relative, but there are certain stories with certain people, and you can choose to take this one way or the other. You can say either, wow, someone seems so much larger than life that it's a compliment by someone doubting their existence, or you can choose to take offense. The choice is yours, to take information or opinion, as I'm recklessly doling out, in whatever manner you'd like. But this is the story of Geraldine Lucas and her cabin, which was architecturally undistinguished from hundreds of log structures constructed in this area called Jackson Hole. But it's unusual because this was the home of a pioneering single woman. I guess what adds an element of suspicion to me is it also is the summer home of Harold Fabian, who was spearheaded John D. Rockefeller's successful effort to expand the boundaries of Grand Teton National Park to include this valley floor, of which this particular homestead became quite pivotal and caught up in the affairs. Here's a rather unremarkable look at the foundation. I don't know if it's precariously balanced on those stones or if that just happens to be the way that this particular photo is taken. I don't know. There's a close-up of the way that the building was constructed. Very tightly seamed, I'd say, for something very old. And not the work of a single woman. Obviously, this building was built for her at paid labor. And I also see the crawl space underneath there. And constructed rather well. It's not the only building on the property. Here's another one. So the story goes is Miss Geraldine Lucas here. She takes up residence here in 1913. This is a newly constructed log cabin. And after she had arrived in the valley, she had looked through here in search of a homestead site before settling on this location, which is at the foot of the Grand Teton mountain range. It's about 160 acres of sagebrush meadows and stands of pine. And flowing within several feet of the cabin is a fair-sized stream that drains the rugged eastern slope of the Teton range. A channel just run off to southward course, sort of, and rendezvous eventually, with the Snake River. Although dry, sandy soil, short growing season equates to limited agricultural potential. But because it's beneath the towering pinnacle of the Grand Teton, the site is noteworthy for its beauty and its isolation. And this woman remained here for the rest of her life. Now, her story is, there's a lonely reach here of northwest Wyoming. Jackson Hole is isolated by virtue of its geography. There's a ring of mountains that form a pretty substantial barrier to settlers, and there's dry and wind-swept high plains. And so the settlement of the Hole was still in its infancy at the time of the 1890 census. The first homestead wasn't until 1884, and Jackson Hole, even at the turn of the century, had about 600 people living there. It reached its peak between 1908 and 1919, and there is a marked change over time in the interests that motivated homesteaders, we're told. If you can imagine people's interests change, I can't. Early homesteaders usually sought to establish farms or ranches, but not always the case. Some of these settlers homesteaded on land that was poorly suited for agriculture, such as Miss Geraldine Lucas, who was hardly a typical homesteader. She was born in Iowa City. At the age of 19, she married a 30-year-old. Marriage did not go smoothly. She left her husband after less than 2 years, 6 months pregnant. The marriage did not end, however, for another 33 years. Interesting number. And soon after, she changed her legal name and her son back to her maiden name. So she had got her education at Oberlin College in Ohio, graduates in 1898. If you're doing the math on that, that means that she is 32 years old when she graduates college. She moves to New York City. She teaches art, music, and sewing until her retirement in 1912, okay? 12 years of teaching, we're told a relatively crappy teacher salary, right? Historically bad teacher salary for 12 years and then retires. If that's the kind of America that we had, where you could teach for 12 years and then retire to a cabin on a creek at the foot of a mountain, then what the bleep did these politicians do to this place? Because either that's an outrageous story, which makes no sense, or America was the easiest place ever to live. Because this woman not only lived here for the rest of her life, she owned a car, she owned a horse, she owned a sled, a team of dogs and a sled, which is how she got around, allegedly. She had a Buick truck. She had over 1,353 books, and she lived here the rest of her life. And she also bought thousands of acres around. Kind of faked the claim. The homesteader had to live on the land for 5 years, make improvements, and cultivate the land. She had kind of like faked it. She met all the requirements. She testified that she had plowed and planted 20 acres, although the crops were totally destroyed. She reported a number of improvements to the property, a 5-room log house, which never existed, a log storehouse, a granary, a rabbit house, a buck pole, wire fencing, 2 irrigation ditches. She was always caught up in these sort of snags, these bureaucracy snags that delayed patent, probably because a lot of it was filed dishonestly. She had a talent for public land acquisition. In fact, it seems like there was a woman named Naomi, a 23-year-old woman who was passing through the area. She invites this woman to stay with her, persuades her to file for a Homestead Act to stay on 160 acres. The second that Naomi buys this, she sold her land to Geraldine, and she apparently was run off and chased back to her home in Michigan because Geraldine was highly protective of her son. She did not want her son to have a romantic relationship with this Naomi girl who was apparently quite attractive. And also she didn't want any of the local men to make a pass at her either. So I don't know if she had romantic interest in this woman or was just jealous of her or not, but it's a very strange story. She takes advantage of public land legislation to increase her acreage. She never had electricity or running water and relied on this little outhouse her entire life. She had a cabin built for her son, who came to visit her once a year, but he never lived in it at all. And so this, paraphrasing, this is all her property. These are random outbuildings, and she was also, of course, caught up in the whole Grand Teton expansion. And after her death, like I said, the Rockefeller assistant came and dwelled there during the course of all that. And so I told you that story very rapidly for the risk of becoming dry and long-winded, which I've probably already done. But I do think it showcases something interesting. Now, what woman could teach for 12 years and afford 1,300 books and retreat into this lovely life by this cabin and yet still have the ability to have multiple properties built on her land and still choose to not have running water or electricity or an outhouse or anything, or a toilet even into the 30s? And we're told this is because she was a reclusive eccentric, which is what we're told dozens and dozens of times over these stories, is that the property was eventually left in the hands of a reclusive, eccentric woman who never left the house, seemed to never need anything, and built up a vast collection. Whether it's books, whether it's Indian artifacts, whether it's art, this is the story that we're continually told, and there's always a connection, as in this happens to be the summer home of a gentleman who worked for John D. Rockefeller and just happened to play a crucial role. She owned strange things like polar bear skulls and woolly mammoth bones that apparently came from her son's trip to Alaska. Very intriguing and compelling and highly suspicious, especially because we're told around the same time it was completely socially unacceptable for a woman to have an outhouse. And here's a woman who could clearly afford these things and wouldn't do it. I don't know. I just find it all to be very suspicious. And I'm not doubting this woman's existence. I don't even know what to think. I don't know where she got her money from. I don't know how 12 years of teaching gets you anything in this world. I really don't. It's bizarre to me. But these are the stories that we're told. These stories of the mining town. Now, this is actually, we're revisiting the old Bentonite company town that was set up. I'm not sure why it jumped back here, but you remember this maybe from the last volume 4, the Yellowstone one, where they only showed us 2 pictures. Well, here's the rest of them clustered in the rest of the story. This is the water tower of the town, and this is the these are random dwellings. This is all gone and bulldozed by now. This is, at one point, these look, I don't even know why you would even build a fence around what. And this has all been destroyed and demolished. This is the machine shop. These are all dwellings, looking very, very temporary if you ask me. This is the machine shop, which is, we're told, the oldest building. I mean, it just looks like it's made for, it could blow over in a storm. This brick part being the only substantial building in the entire town that I can tell. And if you look even closer, you can actually see what appears to be bricked in windows down here, which would make sense that, of course, this was here first and earliest. And somehow this brick portion survived whatever happened. Probably a massive flood, honestly. I mean, wouldn't a massive flood turn into a meadow eventually? A desert and then a meadow? I would think so. And so if you think about the United States, you have the entire western portion covered in some sort of flood, except for the mountains in California and Colorado. And then and elsewhere, of course, the mountains. And as the water recedes, eventually the high plains turn into meadows as grass comes back, and the lower portions remain a desert. And it would seem like that would be the case everywhere you go. This obviously being very modern and crappy. Corrugated metal and no basement. You know, we're not building basements in these corrugated metal buildings. I wonder why. Only in the brick ones. It's just very odd. Very, very odd why would you make one building out of brick in this entire town, the rest out of corrugated metal and siding and shiplap and aluminum, and just let it all collapse. And yet the only building that has a basement just happens to be the brick one. The only building with any subterranean portion happens to be the brick one. I don't know. I don't know how far you're willing to stretch coincidence, but I'm not willing to stretch it very far. Here you've got an underground portion here. This is inside that machine shop. That very same machine shop slash garage, which we're told is the oldest building on the property. And you can tell by the equipment here, and everything else looking rather dumpy in this bentonite clay mine. Even the furnace looks unadorned and unattractive to Ma Brian. And so yeah, in a sense, this is an addendum to the last one, and it's very dry, and for that, I apologize. Now here we have a building. It looks a little bit more substantial, and I'll shock and dismay. Look at that. It does have a basement. Unbelievable. Who would have guessed? And a little area up here for the little bell chamber, or whatever, the belfry, whatever they're called. And a cellar, yes, and brick. Oh, it's so strange, isn't it? It's like we can just predict everything. Even in this dumpy looking administration building, we can just predict what it will look like and what it will have based on the material. This is the barely touched upon last time, the Yellowstone Historic District, complete with basements. Told very little about it. And then we end up back here at the Nez Perce Bridge in Yellowstone as well. This bridge looking like it's actually maybe an honest bridge. I do believe that this one perhaps was constructed by the Army Corps of Engineers, as we're told, out of stacked stones. Although I don't know, because then they lay concrete across the top of it and they just make it look differently. This one is composed entirely of concrete, making it definitely more believable. Now I want to look at something here. As you can tell, this spalling here and this concrete wasting away or eroding away, right? Now imagine this happening in a little more time. Imagine this flaking away as it is, and a little bit more erosion, and the curves of these get rounded. And suddenly you come upon it 50 years later, and you imagine that these are large stones stacked. And you say to yourself, how is it possible that these ancient people had these large stones to stack? But really what you're looking at is concrete with rebar that has eroded away. And keep that in mind when you look at some of these old structures, even this one. That maybe what you're looking at isn't stone, it's concrete. And the rebar has simply eroded away. And this is especially obvious sometimes when you see iron or orange color rust running down, or lines of orange. And just consider the possibility that even what we're told is a modern structure, or what we're told is an ancient structure, could very well be just a modern structure, or at least using the same modern technology as we have now, and just added time to it. I mean, look at this bank here. All these uniform stones. Is that not suspicious? Or does this not look like a wall that's been dilapidated? Now, let's say it's not a stone wall. Let's say it's a concrete wall that had rebar in between, and the rebar eroded away, and the wall collapsed. Or this is a canal bank. That was a moat that was just not composed of stones, but concrete with rebar running through it, reinforced. And gradually the rebar eroded, and the concrete left in these uniform stones. It's impossible to say. I agree. I just think that we need to look at the world through different eyes, and if they tell you one thing, consider it, but also consider another. And consider the fact that our our forefathers, the people that came before us, maybe they have the same exact technology we did. And maybe this indeed was just concrete wall with rebar through it. I don't know. I'm just saying there are many possibilities. And anything to throw us off, including from within our own community, should be examined and should be questioned. And then later on, those questions should then be questioned. Even I should be questioned. And the things I say, and the opinions I hold. In fact, I'd like to go back sometimes to some of my original videos and see if my opinions have changed, see if I've learned or grown at all. I imagine that I probably have, but there's certain things that just remain the same. A basement house, gone and replaced. Maybe a tornado tore the top off. I don't know, but no one builds like this. No one would build like this, except if it were easier. You don't dig a dugout because it's the most difficult to style a building, the most conducive. You do it because it's easier. You don't dig a basement like this unless it's easier. And the only way this would be easier is if this foundation was already there, and then you built the wood on top. Maybe I'm wrong. And look at these. Are these stone blocks? No, just concrete walls with rebar in them and seams. So add a few decades to this, or maybe some erosive sandstorms, and put this out in Egypt, blow the top part off. Suddenly you have ancient megalithic foundations. And I'm not saying they don't exist. I'm not saying they do exist either. I'm saying question everything. And that's the only way that we learn who we are. We go through boring tracts of stories. This cat just loves to be on camera, doesn't it? No matter where you go, the cat's like, what about me? What about me? What about me? I mean, if this was in Armenia, you could come up with a very ancient story about it being the remains of Jericho. Or just an old concrete house fell apart. I don't know. The more I learn, the less I learn, or the more I unlearn, or the more I learn I don't know. I don't know. What is this? This is insane. So there we are, Wyoming. This is a dry and a boring one. And we're going to get back to it and back to these after I do my research. And I'll see you soon.